Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. I'm glad you're here tonight. Wherever you're listening from, make yourself comfortable. Let the day soften a little. Let your shoulders settle, your breathing find its own slow pace. The small tensions in your hands loosen. There is nowhere you need to be for a while, nothing you need to hold on to. In the summer of 1939, on a quiet Suffolk field, archaeologists lifted the earth off a 90-foot ship that should not have survived, filled with Byzantine silver and garnets cut in Sri Lanka, burying a king whose people left almost no record of how they came to own England at all. If you enjoy these slow histories, a like and a subscribe help the work find its people, and sharing it with someone who sleeps to stories keeps this little night watch going. If you want to support a bit further, the Patreon link is in the description, entirely at your leisure. Tonight we trace how that island went from Roman province to Anglo-Saxon England, from 4110 to the year the ships came again. So let the room settle, and we will begin with the leaving of Rome. Chapter 1: The Leaving. In the year 400, Britain was still Roman. The towns had walls and markets, the roads ran straight to London, and tax collectors still kept their lists. Villas in the Cotswolds had mosaic floors and hypocaust heating, and their owners thought of themselves as Romans who happened to live far north. That identity had lasted for more than 3 centuries, since Claudius sent legions in 43, and it rested on law and coinage and an army that was paid from Ravenna rather than on any simple affection for Italy. It felt permanent to those living inside it. That feeling would not survive the decade. The winter of 406 broke the frontier. Vandals, Suevi, and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine near Mainz, and the Central Army had no means to seal the breach. Reports of cities burning in Gaul traveled fast along the military roads. In Britain, where the garrisons had already been thinned to support usurpers and continental wars, the news meant that pay and orders might not come again, because Ravenna was now fighting for its own survival rather than for a distant province. Fear concentrated minds in the barracks. The army looked for a man who could hold authority when the center could not. That man was Constantine. He was a common soldier in Britain, raised by his comrades in 407 to emperor. The name was useful. It recalled the first Christian emperor and promised stability. Constantine crossed to Gaul with what remained of the British field army, taking the last regular units that had guarded the Saxon shore forts, and for a short while he actually controlled Gaul and Spain and was recognized by Honorius in Ravenna. Britain was left to itself. His failure in 411, when imperial officers captured and executed him at Ravenna, closed the door behind those troops. Rome was sacked in August of 410. Alaric and his Goths entered the city after a siege, and the shock rippled to every province. In that same year, Honorius sent a communication to the British civitates. The text does not survive, only a brief note by the 6th century historian Zosimus, who recorded that Honorius wrote to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defenses, because there would be no more help from the empire. The letter was not a grant of independence. It was an acknowledgement that the imperial machinery which had moved men and grain for centuries had simply stopped. Zosimus may have misplaced details. Some historians now think the rescript was addressed to Brutium in Italy, not Britannia, and that a copyist confused the names. The confusion matters less than the reality on the ground. Whether or not Honorius wrote to Britain in exactly those words, the British cities were in fact looking to their own defenses by 410, minting no new imperial coins, receiving no new officers, and governing through local councils and whatever leaders could keep a wall standing. Gildas would remember it bitterly. Writing around 540, he described a Britain that had lost Roman habits and Roman help in the same generation. Gildas is the first voice after the silence. He was a monk, probably in the West, writing his De Excidio Britanniae as both history and sermon. His Latin is dense and angry, full of Old Testament parallels. He claimed that after Rome withdrew, the Britons sent envoys to the Romans for aid against Picts and Scots, that the Romans came once or twice under a leader he did not name, and that in the end Rome told them it would not cross the sea again for such a troublesome province. That story shaped everything that followed. Even when Gildas exaggerated, his outline matched what archaeology later showed. The economy thinned quickly after 410. The last official coin shipments from the mints at Trier and Lyons stopped, and British hoards after that date contained clipped siliquae cut down to stretch silver. Potters stopped making mass-produced wares. The great Oxfordshire kilns that had supplied the province cooled, and towns like Wroxeter began to reuse stone rather than quarry new. At London, the basilica fell silent and its roof tiles slipped. Life continued, but on a smaller, more local scale. Power did not vanish, it localized. Inscriptions and later histories suggest that town councils and regional warlords took responsibility for defense. Germanus of Auxerre, a Gallic bishop who visited Britain in 429, met men who still called themselves wealthy and well-born. Germanus had come to debate the Pelagian heresy, which denied original sin, but his visit also shows that the channel was still crossable, that Latin Christianity persisted, and that British leaders could still host a continental dignitary with some ceremony. These leaders would soon be called tyrants. Gildas used the word tyrannus for kings who ruled without imperial legitimacy. Around 446, the Britons wrote again. Gildas preserves the gist of a letter addressed to Aetius, then master of soldiers in the west. The message said that barbarians were driving them toward the sea, and that the sea was driving them back toward barbarians, and that only slaughter or drowning remained. Aetius did not come. He was preparing to meet Attila the Hun in Gaul, and Britain was beyond his reach. The appeal failed, and that failure entered British memory as a turning point. The empire had its own arithmetic. After 440, Aetius needed every soldier to hold the line on the Rhine and in the Loire Valley. Britain paid no taxes to Ravenna, so Ravenna sent no legions to Britain. That calculation was cold but rational, because an emperor who could not protect Arles could hardly spare a fleet for Aberacum, and the Britons had to understand that the world which had governed them for 400 years was no longer listening. The silence was definitive. From that moment, Britain was a former province learning new politics. Raiding intensified in the north and west. Picts from beyond the old wall and Scots from Ireland struck the coasts where Roman forts had once watched. Irish settlements took root in Wales and Cornwall, leaving Ogham stones as quiet markers. Gildas described these years as a time of alternating war and plenty, when Britons sometimes won battles under leaders like Ambrosius Aurelianus, whom he called the last of the Romans, and sometimes lost ground because their own kings fought each other as fiercely as they fought outsiders. Unity never came. The island fragmented into rival centers that would soon face another pressure from the east. Into that fragmentation came the Saxons. At first, they arrived as small war bands, hired for defense, paid with food and land. Later sources name a British leader who made that decision, calling him Vortigern, a word that may have been a title meaning High King. Whatever his real name, the policy he represented was familiar to Romans, who had used federates on the frontiers for generations, though in Britain the difference was that there was no imperial treasury to keep those federates loyal once the first winter passed. Payment required land. Land required settlement, and settlement would change the language of lowland Britain within 2 generations. Archaeology complicates the written story. At Wroxeter, the old Roman town called Viraconium, timber buildings rose inside the ruined basilica. Someone kept laying out streets and repairing thresholds long after imperial administration ended. At Tintagel on the Cornish coast, fragments of amphorae from the eastern Mediterranean show that traders still came for tin, even when the empire that had once organized that trade was gone, which suggests that British kings still had something to exchange and still knew how to invite ships. The world got smaller, not empty. It turned inward and held onto Roman shapes for as long as it could. One building at Wroxeter tells the story plainly. In the late 5th century, workmen set posts for a great timber hall directly over the old civic center. The hall measured nearly 50 meters, its roof held by rows of oak uprights. The man who ordered it was not a Roman official, but his carpenters still paced out the building with Roman measurements, because that was the only way they knew to make a large space seem legitimate and ordered after generations of living by those measurements. Authority borrowed old forms. That borrowing lasted until the mid-6th century, when even Wroxeter finally fell quiet. By 500, the province was gone. No one collected tribute for Ravenna. No one waited for a governor from across the sea. Yet Latin survived in western stones, and Christianity survived in pockets of the north and west. The Anglo-Saxons who were settling in the east did not bring churches at first, and the British clergy wrote almost nothing about them for a century, which is why the 5th century feels so dark to historians who have only Gildas and a handful of Gallic chronicles to guide them. Dark does not mean empty. It means the record is thin, and thin records force careful reading. In 450, Britain was neither Roman nor English. It was a collection of British kingdoms holding Roman memories and defending river crossings with spears. The Saxon shore, once a Roman command, had become a shoreline of new villages with sunken floors and handmade pottery. That change was not an overnight replacement, for cemeteries like Mucking in Essex show British and Saxon burial practices overlapping for decades, which suggests that conquest was often a slow negotiation of neighbors rather than a single battle that swept everything away. Languages shifted first. Place names followed, with Ham and Tone replacing older British forms across the lowlands. By the time Gildas wrote, that linguistic frontier had stabilized. British kings still ruled in the west, from Dumnonia to Strathclyde. Saxon kings ruled in the east, in Kent and Essex and Anglia, their names already sounding different. The Roman province had become two cultural zones that would fight and intermarry and convert each other over the next 200 years, though in 540 no one could have predicted which language would be spoken at London Bridge in 700. The leaving was complete. What came next would be built from timber, oath, and borrowed Roman stone. Honorius never saw Britain again. His rescript, whether intended for this island or another, marked a boundary in practice. The towns learned to govern, the bishops learned to argue without appeal to Arles, and the soldiers learned to serve kings whose names had never appeared on imperial rolls. That was the new world. Its roads still pointed to London, even when London had no orders to send. And in the fields beyond, new villages were already laying out their boundaries. Chapter 2: The Coming. Britain had learned to fight without Rome. The walls were still standing, but the men to man them had to be found somewhere else. Councils in the lowlands made the same decision that Roman commanders had made on the Rhine. They would hire Germanic warriors from across the North Sea, give them food and a place to settle, and expect them to fight Picts in the north and Scots in the west, because federate service had kept the empire intact for 100 years before its western half fell. It was a familiar policy. In Britain, it produced a result that Roman administrators had never intended. Gildas gave the decision a name. He called the man who made it Superbus Tyrannus a proud tyrant and blamed him for inviting ruin. Later tradition called that figure Vortigern, a word that may have meant over-king rather than a personal name. Gildas, writing around 540, was not interested in chronology, so he placed the invitation somewhere after the appeal to Aetius and before his own childhood, which leaves historians to argue whether the first federates arrived in the 420s or the 440s, and whether there was one invitation or many. The pattern matters more than the date. British leaders hired soldiers they could not control once the payment changed. Bede gave the soldiers names. In his ecclesiastical history completed in 731, he wrote that the Britons invited Saxons, led by brothers Hengist and Horsa. The names mean stallion and horse, which suggests they may have been titles or legends rather than men. Bede placed their arrival in 449, said they landed at Ebbsfleet in Kent, and added that they came from 3 tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, a neat division that archaeology has made much messier since his monastery library at Jarrow held no excavation reports. Still, the story stuck. Kentish kings later traced their descent from Hengist to claim legitimacy over rivals. The newcomers came from the coast between Frisia and Jutland. They were not a single people with a single king, but many small groups with similar language and ships. Their language was early Germanic, close enough to be mutually intelligible across those groups, and distant enough from Brittonic to mark a boundary. They built clinker ships that could cross the North Sea in a day and a half with a fair wind. They farmed the same heavy clays as lowland Britain, and they measured status in gold rings and cattle rather than in mosaic floors and written law, which made their world portable. That portability mattered. When British pay failed, they could take land instead of wages. The first settlement was limited. Gildas said the Saxons were settled in the east to beat back northern peoples. Bede specified Thanet, the island off eastern Kent that was separated then by a wide channel. Thanet made sense as a base for federates because it could be supplied by boat. It overlooked the Thames estuary, and it kept the newcomers close enough to be watched while still distant enough to be denied the inland fields that British farmers wanted to keep. Payment was a nona, grain. Grain had to be collected, carried, and handed over each harvest, which created friction every autumn. The ground confirms a slow start. At Mucking in Essex, excavations in the 1960s and 1970s uncovered two cemeteries and more than 50 sunken featured buildings. The buildings were small, with a pit below a suspended floor, used as workshops or houses or both. Pottery from those pits was handmade, bonfire fired, and decorated with stamped patterns that match vessels from the Elbe estuary, which shows that people, not just ideas, cross the water because such domestic habits travel only with the hands that practice them. Numbers remained modest at first. Mucking grew over a century, not in a single season of invasion. One grave at Mucking holds the shift. Burial 600, a woman interred in the late 5th century, lay with a pair of copper alloy brooches and a string of amber beads. Her brooches were cruciform, a style that develops from the Rhineland to eastern England and marks Saxon dress. A few meters away lay a man buried with a spear and a British-style belt fitting, and the proximity of their plots suggests that the cemetery served a community that already mixed traditions, even while its language and dress were becoming more Saxon with each generation. Identity was becoming fluid. That fluidity makes simple stories of total replacement unreliable for this period. The agreement broke down. Gildas said the Saxons complained that their monthly supplies were insufficient and began to ravage the countryside. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled centuries later in Wessex, placed a battle at Aylesford in 455. There, according to the Chronicle, Hengist and Horsa fought Vortigern. Horsa fell, and Hengist took Kent, though the entry was written to justify a Kentish dynasty that already ruled and therefore must be read as politics as much as record. Conflict spread after that. Villages in the Thames Valley burned and were rebuilt with different house plans. Settlement followed rivers. The Thames, Ouse, and Trent carried people and grain inland toward heavier soils. Names with Ham meaning homestead and Ingas meaning people of appear earliest along those waterways. By 500 small kingdoms had names that sound tribal rather than territorial, like Cantware for the people of Kent and East Seeks for the Saxons east of London, which reflects how groups saw themselves before they drew firm borders on maps that did not yet exist. Forest remained extensive. British speech held on in wooded highlands, while Old English spread across cleared lowlands. Resistance did not end with Vortigern. Gildas described a generation of chaos, then a recovery led by Ambrosius Aurelianus. He said Ambrosius was of Roman stock, the survivor of a family that had worn the purple, and that he rallied Britons against the Saxons. That description is important because it shows British leaders still claiming Roman legitimacy long after Ravenna stopped answering letters, and because it places a Roman British identity at the heart of the resistance that later Welsh poetry would turn into legend. Ambrosius was not Arthur. He was earlier, more political, and far less mythologized in his own century. Badon was the climax. Gildas mentioned a siege of Badon Hill where Britons won a great victory in his parents' generation. He did not name the leader, but later sources associated the battle with Ambrosius and with Arthur, whose name first appears much later. Badon probably fought around 500 somewhere in the south, perhaps at Bath or Little Salisbury, halted Saxon expansion for a generation, which is why Gildas could write in a Britain that was still divided rather than fully overrun. The pause mattered. It allowed British kingdoms in the west to consolidate and Saxon groups in the east to become kingdoms themselves. Gildas wrote in that pause. His Britain had perhaps 24 small kings, some British, some Saxon, all Christian or becoming Christian at different speeds. He listed 5 British tyrants by name: Constantine, Aurelius Canis, Vortipor, Cunuglassus, and Maglacunus, and scolded each for sins. That list is a rare window into 6th century politics because it shows British power still active in Wales and the southwest, ruling from hill forts like Dynevor and Tintagel, while eastern kings like those in Kent were already minting gold coins that copied Merovingian designs. 2 worlds coexisted. They traded and raided and intermarried constantly while claiming completely different ancestors and gods. How many came remains debated. Early historians imagined mass invasion, later historians imagined tiny elite takeover, and current work finds something between. Place name evidence shows Old English replacing Brittonic quickly in the east, but slowly in the west. Genetic studies of modern populations suggest that British ancestry persisted in large numbers even where language changed, which indicates that culture and speech can shift without complete population replacement, especially when new law and status reward speaking the language of the new elite. Language was power. Learning Saxon speech meant access to courts where Wergild was counted in that speech. The new society was kin-based. Freemen belonged to kindreds who paid and received compensation for injuries. That compensation was called Wergild, man price, and it differed by rank. A seerl, a free farmer, might be valued at 200 shillings, while a nobleman called an earl or thegn would be worth many times that amount. So law was not equality but a tariff that made violence expensive enough to prevent endless blood feud. Oaths mattered enormously. A man swore with oath helpers, and his word was weighed by his status. Kings emerged from successful war leaders. They claimed descent from Woden, the god of war and poetry, to sanctify their rule. Genealogies recorded by Bede and later by the Chronicle trace Kent, Mercia, and Wessex back to that god. Those genealogies were political tools, not family trees, because they linked rival houses to a common divine ancestor, while also asserting that the current king was the rightful heir of the founders Hengist, Serdic, or Isel, whose deeds were remembered only in alliterative verse. Power was personal. It moved with the king and his war band, not with a capital city. Our sources are uneven. Gildas wrote to condemn, not to chronicle, and he left dates vague. Bede wrote to show how English people became a chosen people through conversion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun under Alfred in the late ninth century, projected Wessex origins backward and gave precise years to events that earlier writers had left floating, which means its dates before 600 must be treated with caution, even when they feel satisfyingly specific. Archaeology fills gaps. It does not give names, but it gives houses, brooches, and boundaries. By 550, the map had changed. Anglo-Saxon cemeteries dotted eastern England from Kent northward to the Humber estuary. British kingdoms held the west, the north, and much of what is now the Midlands interior. In between lay contested woodland and fen where neither British nor Saxon law ran firmly, and where cattle raiding provided young men with a route to status when grain harvests failed and tribute could not be paid. The frontier moved slowly. It moved with marriages, baptisms, and battles, not with a single sweeping invasion. By 600, the coming was complete. Lowland Britain spoke Old English in its fields and courts, even where British blood remained in its families. Small kingdoms now claimed ancestry from ships and gods rather than from legions. The men who had been hired to defend a province had become kings of their own provinces, and the superboost tyrannus who had hired them, whether named Vortigern or remembered only as a title, had passed into stories that blamed him for a change no single man could have controlled. That is how settlement happens. It begins with a bargain and ends with a new language being spoken at dusk. Chapter 3: Small Kingdoms. After Badon, the East did not vanish. Saxon groups used the long pause after Badon to turn war camps into permanent kingdoms. Their leaders had been warlords. Now they needed to become kings who could collect food and enforce law. That transition required more than battles, because a kingdom had to convince farmers to bring grain to a hall rather than hide it in pits, and it had to convince neighboring peoples that its borders, even if marked only by a river or a wood, would be defended each spring. Timber made that possible. Wood, ditch, and oath held these early kingdoms together before stone and charter did. Bede later counted 7 kingdoms. He listed Kent, Sussex, Wessex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria as the main powers. The word heptarchy itself is not Anglo-Saxon. It was invented by later historians to organize a messy map. In reality, the number of kings was always larger than 7, because smaller folk like the Huike, Magonsaye, and Lindsay kept their own rulers for generations before larger neighbors absorbed them, and because Northumbria itself was often 2 kingdoms rather than 1. 7 was a tidy number. The ground itself was never that tidy in any century of the 6th or 7th. Kent led first. Its position facing the Frankish coast gave it access to gold, wine, and Frankish brides. Ethelbert, who ruled from around 560 to 616, married Bertha, daughter of the Frankish king Charibert. Bertha brought a bishop named Liudhard and her own Christian practice to Canterbury, which meant that Kentish kings knew how to talk to Merovingian courts long before Augustine arrived, and that Kentish graves contained Frankish brooches and glass vessels that other regions did not yet possess. Wealth concentrated there early. Canterbury and Faversham burials show gold and garnet work of exceptional quality. South of Kent lay smaller peoples. The South Saxons, later Sussex, were remembered through El, whom Bede called the first to hold imperium over other kings. The chronicle placed his arrival in 477 and credited him with taking Pevensey in 491. Those dates are too neat and were written centuries later, but they point to a real process in which Saxon warbands took control of the old Saxon shore forts and turned their Roman walls into strongholds that could be held with a few dozen men. Essex was similarly small. Its kings traced descent from Sled and called themselves East Sikhs, ruling from London and Rendlesham at different times. Wessex grew from obscurity. The chronicle claimed its founder was Cerdic, who landed in 495 and fought Britons until 519. Cerdic is a British name, not Germanic, which suggests the story mixed peoples from the start. Modern work places the early West Saxons not in the upper Thames, but in the middle Thames and Hampshire, where their name Gavisse, meaning companions or allies, fits better than a story of conquest from the sea, because early Wessex power depended on alliances as much as battles. Kingship there was fluid. Cealan, who ruled around 560 to 592, was the first West Saxon whom Bede recognized as holding power beyond his own people. East Anglia kept its own line. Its kings called themselves Wuffingas, descendants of a wolf, and ruled from Rendlesham near the Deben estuary. The estuary gave access to the North Sea and to Frankish and Scandinavian trade. In its cemeteries at Spong Hill and Morningthorpe, urns contain cremated bone mixed with combs and toilet sets, which shows that even death was managed with care for appearance, and that pagan ritual still organized community long after some Western kings had accepted baptism. Wealth gathered there too. That wealth was buried in mounds overlooking the Deben, not scattered in hordes. Sutton Hoo is the clearest window. In 1939, archaeologist Basil Brown opened Mound 1 and found a ship, not a chest of treasure alone. The ship was 90 feet long, clinker built, with room for 40 rowers, and it had been dragged uphill from the river. Inside lay a burial chamber containing a gold buckle weighing more than a pound, a purse of Merovingian coins that date the burial to around 625, Byzantine silverware, and a helmet with a masked face, all arranged around a space where a body had decayed away, probably that of Raedwald, king of the East Angles, who died around that year, and who Bede said kept both Christian and pagan altars. The garnets came from Sri Lanka. The craftsmanship shows a kingdom that could command distant trade and skilled smiths. Mercia lay inland. Its name means border people, and it formed along the Trent where British and Saxon settlements met. Early kings Isel and Creota are shadowy, their deeds preserved only in genealogy. By the early 7th century, Mercia controlled salt from Drottich and iron from the Forest of Dean, which gave it resources that coastal kingdoms lacked, and it used those resources to maintain war bands that could march to the Thames and to the Welsh hills in the same season. Its center was Tamworth. Tamworth lay on a crossing of rivers, easy to defend and easy to leave. In the north, two kingdoms formed. Bernicia, based around Bamberg and the Tyne, and Dira, based around York and the Derwent, were rivals before they were partners. Ida, who ruled Bernicia from around 547, was remembered as the wall builder who set his fortress on the basalt rock at Bamberg. Ale of Deira, a different ale from the Sussex king, ruled at the same time in the south, and his daughter and son would link the two kingdoms through marriage and bloodshed, because Northumbrian history is a cycle of union and revenge that Bede tried to smooth into a story of progress. Union came under Aethelfrith. Aethelfrith of Bernicia, called the Ravager, joined Dira by conquest around 604 and exiled its royal family. Edwin returned. The exiled prince of Dira, son of El, grew up in Mercia and East Anglia under foreign protection. In 6161, with help from Raedwald of East Anglia, he killed Aethelfrith at the River Idle and took both northern kingdoms. Edwin then ruled from York and Bamberg, demanded tribute as far south as Kent, and was called by Bede the most powerful English king of his time, a man whose court at Yevering included a great timber hall 60 meters long, where smoke from the hearth darkened the roof timbers within a single winter. His reign marked a peak. It ended in 632 when Penda of Mercia and Cadwallon of Gwynedd killed him at Hatfield Chase. Kingdoms were not lines on maps. They were peoples bound by oath, by common law, and by a king who could feed his followers. Bede used the word gens for these peoples, a people rather than a territory. Boundaries were rivers, ridges, and wastes where law ran thin, and a king proved his power not by patrolling a frontier, but by collecting food renders from villages that recognized his name, and by punishing those that did not, which made control seasonal and personal rather than permanent. Power moved with the court. The king ate his way through his kingdom, holding feasts in royal villas. The hall was the center. At Yevering in Northumberland, excavations uncovered a complex of timber halls, enclosures, and a large assembly structure. The largest hall measured over 25 meters, its walls double-planked against the northern wind. Beside it stood a building interpreted as a temple or cult house, later replaced by a Christian church on the same alignment, which shows how sacred space was reused when kings changed gods, because continuity of place mattered more than continuity of doctrine to people who gathered there. Feasting was politics. A king who gave rings and meat secured loyalty that law alone could not. Law was compensation. Injury was priced, and the price was paid to kin to stop further killing. Wergild for a seor, for a thane, for a king, each had its figure recorded and remembered. When a man was killed, his kindred could demand the price or take revenge, and most law codes from Ethelbert onward try to push communities toward payment rather than feud, because a kingdom where every death led to another death could not collect its grain or man its frontier. kings took a share. That share, called white, gave kings an interest in justice as revenue. War was seasonal and personal. Campaigns began after the harvest, when men could be spared and food could be carried. Armies were small, a few hundred warriors at most, drawn from a king's household and allied kindreds. They fought on foot in a shield wall, overlapping linden boards forming a hedge of wood and iron, and battles were often decided by which line held its nerve longer, rather than by elaborate maneuver, because open ground and close kin made retreat shameful and hard to manage. Victory brought tribute. Defeat often meant exile, tundra, or death in a neighboring kingdom that had waited for weakness. These kingdoms were still pagan. They worshipped Woden, Thunor, and Ti, gods of kingship, thunder, and law, whose names survive in Wednesday, Thursday, and Tuesday. Sacred places were groves, springs, and high places, not stone temples built to last. At Yevering, a structure was found with cattle skulls deposited in pits and oriented east-west, which suggests seasonal sacrifice, and at other sites like Harrow on the Hill, the name itself, meaning heathen shrine, preserves memory of places where such rites were done before churches replaced them. Burial showed belief. Grave goods included weapons, combs, and pots of food for the journey after death. Trade revived slowly. After the end of imperial coin, Britain made almost no new currency for a century. Gold thrimses, copying Merovingian trimisses, appeared in Kent around 580 and spread northward. Those coins traveled with merchants who sold Frankish glass, Baltic amber, and Frisian cloth along the eastern rivers, and the tolls they paid at places like Ipswich and Londonwick helped kings who controlled those ports to fund halls and hire warriors who otherwise lived on grain alone. Ports were royal creations. Ipswich ware, a wheel-thrown pottery, spread from East Anglia to other kingdoms in the 7th century. By 650, the map looked settled. Northumbria stretched from the Forth to the Humber, Mercia held the middle, and Wessex pressed toward the southwest. Kent, Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia remained distinct but smaller, paying tribute when stronger kings demanded it. That pattern of overlordship, where a king might be called Bretwalda or holder of wide rule without directly governing distant peoples, explains why Bede could list 7 great kings who held imperium, while still recognizing that many other kings ruled at the same time under their shadow. Power shifted quickly. A death in battle could undo 20 years of tribute gathering in a single afternoon. These were earth and timber kingdoms. Their boundaries were walked, not surveyed. Their laws were spoken, not written down at first. Yet from that material came Sutton Hoo gold, Yevering halls, and genealogies that would last centuries. The small peoples of the 5th century had become kingdoms that could talk to Francia as peers, bury kings in ships like old Germanic heroes, and remember Roman walls as quarries and as symbols, which prepared them for the next change that would come not from a ship, but from a book. That change was conversion. It would bind these rival kingdoms with a common language of church and charter. Chapter 4: The Conversion. In 597, most English kings were pagan. They kept shrines and groves and measured time by feasts to Woden and Thunor. Christianity had not disappeared from the island, but it lived in the west and north beyond Saxon rule. In Wales, Cornwall, and western Scotland, monks like those at Wythorn and Llantwit preserved Latin books, and in Ireland, which had never been Roman, monasteries at Clonmacnoise and Iona produced ascetics who believed that exile for Christ was the highest calling, which meant that two Christian traditions faced the pagan English from different directions. Both would soon arrive. Their meeting would shape English identity more than any battle. Kent was the first bridge. Bertha, daughter of Charibert of Paris, had married Ethelbert around 580 on condition she could practice her faith. She brought her chaplain Luthard, and Bede said she restored a Roman church outside Canterbury for her prayers. In Rome, Pope Gregory, who had known Kentish slaves or merchants in the market, and who had been told that their people were called Angles, saw a chance to extend papal authority through a Frankish connected court, and in 595 he chose Augustine, prior of his own monastery on the Caelian Hill, to lead a mission. Augustine hesitated. Gregory sent letters to Frankish kings to secure interpreters and supplies for the journey. The mission landed in spring 597. Augustine and about 40 monks came ashore on Thanet, the same island where Hengist had once been settled. They waited there and sent word to Ethelbert, who came to meet them in the open air. Bede reported that Ethelbert feared that a building might contain magic, which shows that pagan and Christian ideas of sacred space were still colliding, and that the king chose to hear the new teaching under an oak where his own priests would have felt more at ease. Augustine preached through interpreters. Ethelbert listened and allowed the monks to live in Canterbury and to restore another old church. Canterbury became the base. Within a year, Ethelbert accepted baptism, the first English king to do so, probably in 598 or 599. Bede described the event simply, noting that the king rejoiced and that many of his people followed because a king's religion set a pattern. Augustine then sent Lawrence and Peter to Rome with questions about how to organize churches, how to handle marriages that were too close by Roman standards, and how to deal with temples that were still used. And Gregory answered that temples should be cleansed and reused rather than destroyed, because people would come more willingly to places they already knew. That policy shaped stone and timber. At Canterbury, the Church of St. Martin, Bertha's chapel, still contains Roman brick reused by Augustine's builders. From Kent, the faith spread. Augustine consecrated Mellitus as bishop to the East Saxons and Justus as bishop to Rochester, creating small outposts. In 604, a church dedicated to St. Paul was founded within the old Roman walls of London. The success depended on royal favor, so when Ethelbert died in 6116 and Sabert of Essex died at almost the same time, both kingdoms reverted to pagan practice, and Mellitus was driven out of London by East Saxons, who, according to Bede, wanted their old rights back rather than communion bread they did not understand. Kent wobbled. Ethelbert's son Eadbald returned to paganism briefly before accepting Christianity again and securing Kent as a Christian kingdom. The next frontier was the north. Edwin of Northumbria, who had regained his kingdom in 616, married Ethelber, daughter of Ethelbert of Kent, around 625. Aethelberh came north with her own chaplain, Paulinus, just as Bertha had come south with Leudhard. Paulinus, a tall man with dark hair who Bede described as ascetic and zealous, worked for more than a year among Northumbrians before Edwin agreed to baptism, because Edwin, according to Bede, wanted to consult his counselors and to weigh whether the new faith would bring victory and stability as much as salvation. The baptism took place in York. In April 6 2000 Fen, Edwin and many of his nobles were baptized in a small wooden church built for the occasion. The conversion did not hold everywhere. In 632 Penda of Mercia, still pagan, and Cadwallon of Gwynedd, Christian but hostile to Northumbria, killed Edwin at Hatfield Chase. Paulinus fled south with Queen Aethelberh and her children, taking the gold vessels of the York Church. Bede recorded that a year of chaos followed when Northumbria split again into Bernicia and Deira, that pagan worship returned in many villages, and that those who had been baptized under Paulinus found themselves without a bishop to confirm their children or consecrate their dead. The Roman mission stalled. A different Christianity would re-enter from the north, carried by Irish monks. Oswald changed the direction. Son of Ethelfrith, he had grown up in exile among the Irish of Dalriada and Iona. In 634 he returned, killed Cadwallon at Heavenfield near Hexham, and reunited Northumbria under his rule. Oswald then asked Iona, not Canterbury, for a bishop, because his childhood faith had been shaped by Columban monks who walked rather than rode, who valued poverty and memorized psalms in cold cells, and who believed that a bishop should live like his people rather than like a Roman official. Iona sent Aidan. Aidan arrived in 635 and chose Lindisfarne, a tidal island visible from Bamberg, as his base. Aidan lived simply. Bede, who admired him greatly, wrote that Aidan traveled on foot, spoke to slaves and kings with the same courtesy, and gave away gifts as soon as he received them. Lindisfarne was cut off twice daily. When the tide rose, the causeway disappeared, and the monastery became an island again. From there, Aidan walked across Northumbria, establishing churches and teaching children to read psalms in both English and Irish. Oswald himself translated for him at first, because the king spoke Irish and his people did not. Oswald ruled as a Christian king. He placed a wooden cross at Heavenfield before battle, and Bede treated that cross as a sign of divine favor. In 642, Oswald was killed by Penda at Maserfield, and his head and limbs were set up on posts. His brother Oswiu succeeded, recovered the relics, and continued the alliance with Iona, which meant that for a generation Northumbrian Christianity looked more Irish than Roman, with monks who kept Easter on a different calculation and cut their hair in a different shape from the clergy in Canterbury. Two traditions now overlapped. Canterbury followed Rome, Lindisfarne followed Iona, and kings had to choose which Easter to keep. Mercia resisted conversion longest. Penda, who ruled from about 626 to 655, remained pagan and killed 3 Christian kings who opposed him. He defeated Edwin in 632, Oswald in 642, and campaigned against East Anglia and Wessex without accepting baptism. Bede, who disliked Penda, still admitted his power because he could march from the Trent to the Forth, and his paganism allowed him to ally with both British Christian kings, like Cadwallon, and with Saxon pagans who feared Northumbrian dominance more than they feared Christian liturgy. His death changed everything. In 655, Osiu killed Penda at the Winwade, and Mercia was baptized under royal pressure soon after. The difference between Iona and Canterbury was visible. Irish monks shaved the front of the head, Roman monks shaved a circle on the crown. Irish Easter could fall a month apart from Roman Easter because they used an older 19-year cycle. For kings who tried to keep a court where some observed one Easter while others still fasted, the discrepancy was not theological abstraction, but a practical problem of when to feast and when to pray, and it created situations where, as Bede noted, a king might be celebrating while his queen was still mourning Lent. Unity required a decision. Osiu, who had learned Irish Christianity but married a Kentish princess who kept Roman Easter, faced that decision directly. Whitby settled the matter. In 664, Osiu called a synod at the double monastery of Whitby, ruled by Abbess Hild. Hild, a great-granddaughter of Edwin, had been baptized by Paulinus and later founded Whitby on a headland above the North Sea. At Whitby, Colman spoke for Iona, Wilfrid spoke for Rome, and Oswiu listened because Wilfrid argued that Peter held the keys to heaven and that Columba, however holy, did not, and because Oswiu did not want to be at odds with the doorkeeper when his time came. Oswiu chose Rome. Colman left Lindisfarne for Ireland, taking some relics and some monks who would not change Easter. After Whitby, the English Church aligned with Rome. That alignment brought organization, law books, and contact with the continent that Irish links had not provided on the same scale. It did not erase Irish influence, which remained in learning, handwriting, and the habit of penance. Lindisfarne itself continued under Roman Easter, producing in the early 8th century the Lindisfarne Gospels, written by Edfrith in honor of Cuthbert, whose pages mixed insular interlace with Mediterranean models, and whose colophon, added by Aldred in the 10th century, gave the oldest English translation of the Gospels between the lines. Books replaced swords as prestige. A king who owned a gospel book owned something that took a year to make and a lifetime to copy. Women shaped the new church. Double monasteries, housing both monks and nuns under an abbess, became centers of learning and politics. Hild of Whitby ruled such a house, advising kings and training bishops who would later serve across England. Aethelthryth, daughter of Anna of East Anglia, founded Ely on an island in the Fens in 673 after leaving 2 marriages, and Bede presented her as a model of chastity whose body, when exhumed years later, was said to have remained incorrupt, which helped Ely become a place of pilgrimage and a wealthy landowner. Their lands endured. Ely and Whitby held estates that survived Viking raids and Norman conquest in altered form. Organization came from Theodore. Theodore, a Greek monk from Tarsus, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 668 at age 66. He arrived in England in 669 with Hadrian, an African abbot who became abbot of St. Augustine's. Together they toured kingdoms, divided large dioceses into smaller sees, established schools where English boys learned Greek and Latin, and held councils at Hertford in 672 and Hatfield in 679 that set rules for marriage, for monastic discipline, and for the way bishops should not poach clergy from each other. That structure lasted. Canterbury became a metropolitan see that could speak for an English church, not just a Kentish one. Stone replaced timber in places. At Escombe and Brixworth, early churches used Roman stone and new mortar to create small, thick-walled buildings. At Wearmouth and Jarrow, Benedict Biscop built twin monasteries in Roman style, with glass windows made by craftsmen brought from Gaul. Bede spent his life in that house at Jarrow, writing history and science with books Biscop had collected in Rome, and his ecclesiastical history of the English people, completed in 731, gave the English a past that began with providential conversion rather than with migration and war. Conversion reshaped memory. It gave English kings a common calendar, a common script, and a reason to keep records. By 700, England was Christian. Pagan burial with weapons had largely ended. Churches stood in every kingdom, and bishops met in councils. The faith had come from Canterbury and from Lindisfarne, from Rome and from Iona, and it carried both traditions within it. What had begun with Bertha praying alone in a reused Roman church, and with Aidan walking barefoot across tidal flats, now linked English kings to a network that stretched to Jerusalem, which meant that a dispute over Easter in a hall on the Yorkshire coast had helped to make a people who could be described, for the first time, as English. The kingdoms remained rivals. They now prayed from the same book while plotting against each other, which would be the pattern for centuries. Chapter 5: The Mercian Century. After 655, Mercia could not be ignored. The death of Penda at the Winwade removed the last pagan king and opened the Midlands to Christian kingship. Oswiu of Northumbria briefly ruled Mercia, but Mercian identity was already too strong to be held from York. Within 3 years, Penda's sons Wulfhere and Aethelred had retaken their father's kingdom, restored its war bands, and begun to collect tribute from peoples as far south as the Thames, because Mercia sat in the middle of England and could march in any direction without crossing sea. Geography favored it. That central position made Mercia the arbiter of every southern quarrel for a century. Wulfhere ruled from 658 to 675. Bede called him a man of restless spirit who revived Mercian power after Northumbrian occupation. He campaigned in Wessex, made Essex dependent again, and supported Christian missions while keeping Mercian independence from Canterbury. Wulfhere's brother Aethelred, who ruled from 675 to 704, married Ostrith, sister of Egfrith of Northumbria, and when Ostrith was murdered by Mercian nobles in 697, Aethelred retired to Bardney Monastery, which shows that royal women linked kingdoms but could also become victims when those links failed. Mercian kings learned to use the church. They granted land to monasteries that prayed for them and that recorded their grants in charters. Aethelbald took power in 716. He ruled until 757, the longest reign of any Mercian king, and Bede's correspondent noted his dominance late in Bede's life. Aethelbald claimed overlordship over all people south of the Humber, a claim his charters repeated with increasing confidence. He interfered in Kent, where he controlled Canterbury's mint, in Wessex, where he fought at Burford in 752 and lost ground briefly, and in London, where he could levy tolls on ships that came up the Thames with Frankish wine and Frisian cloth. Charters became his tool. They recorded gifts of land in Latin with Old English boundary clauses that named woods and streams. One charter survives in unusual detail. In 736, Aethelbald granted land at Izmir in Worcestershire to his companion Sinibert to found a minster. The document calls Aethelbald king not only of Mercia, but of all the southern English. That title was not empty boasting, because the charter was witnessed by bishops from Kent and Wessex who would not have traveled to a Mercian court unless they recognized, however reluctantly, that Mercian favor mattered more than their own king's approval that year. Script meant power. A king who could issue such documents controlled literate men who could count hides and tolls. Aethelbald was murdered in 757. Bade's continuation said his own bodyguard killed him at Seckington, and a brief civil war followed. Beornred took the throne, but held it only months before Offa, a distant relative of Aethelbald, drove him out. Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796, would become the most famous Mercian king, not because he founded Mercia, but because he organized it with a thoroughness that earlier war leaders had never attempted, turning tribute into administration and raids into frontiers that could be held year after year. His base was Tamworth. Tamworth sat on the Tame where roads from north and south met, with a great hall and a mill. Offa controlled trade. He held London from 770 onward, Essex after 779, and Kent directly after 7085. London gave tolls, Kent gave silver, and the Midland shires gave grain and men. That combination allowed Offa to pay for warriors who stayed through winter, to hire Frankish masons who could work stone, and to mint a new coinage that was heavier and more consistent than anything England had seen since Rome stopped sending coins 3 centuries earlier. Coinage was policy. A reliable penny made markets possible far beyond the king's own palace. Offa reformed the penny. Around 760, he introduced a broad, thin penny with his name and portrait in Frankish style. The coins were struck at Canterbury, London, and later at other mints under close control. Uniquely, Offa also struck coins in the name of his wife Sinithrith, who was called Regina Merciorum, Queen of the Mercians, and whose image on silver is the only portrait of an English queen before the Norman conquest, which shows how far Offa pushed royal display beyond earlier custom. Money carried his face. Peasants who never saw Tamworth handled his name each market day. The dike is his largest monument. It runs for 73 miles from the Dee estuary in the north to the Wye in the south. The bank and ditch, in places 8 meters high from bottom to top, cut across hills and valleys without regard for convenience. It was not a wall to stop armies, for there was no garrison large enough to man it, but a negotiated frontier that told Welsh kings and Mercian farmers alike where tribute was due and where law changed, because Offa built it after campaigning in Powys and after Welsh sources recorded his men devastating the region in 784. Labor built it. Thousands of men dug for months, fed from Mercian grain stores under royal order. Walking the dike shows planning. Surveyors laid out a line that kept the Welsh side visible and the Mercian side sheltered. At Knighton, the ditch still holds shadow in the afternoon, even where sheep have softened the bank. Archaeology at Landfair Hill and elsewhere shows that the bank was built in sections by different work gangs, each gang leaving slightly different tool marks and turf stacking, which suggests that Offa could command labor from many shires and make them work to a common design even when they never saw each other. That was kingship made earth. It outlasted Offa's charters and his coins, still marking a border 13 centuries later. Offa dominated the south. Kent lost its archbishop's freedom, Wessex married into Mercia, and East Anglia paid heavy tribute. In 794, Offa had Ethelbert of East Anglia beheaded at Sutton Walls, then annexed his kingdom. The chronicle said little, but coins of Ethelbert that were struck and then cut short show a brief independence ended by force, and Alcuin of York wrote a letter reproaching Offa for an act that, in Frankish eyes, made him look like a tyrant rather than a Christian king who should protect the church. Fear was part of rule. Mercian law relied on presence as much as on parchment. Offa quarreled with Canterbury. Archbishop Janebert, a Kentishman, opposed Mercian control of Kentish monasteries and of the Canterbury Mint. Offa petitioned Rome to create a rival archbishopric at Lichfield, closer to Tamworth and easier to influence. In 787, Pope Hadrian agreed, and Higbert of Lichfield was given authority over the Mercian sees, which meant that for 16 years England had two archbishops of equal rank, a situation that pleased Mercia but angered Canterbury, and that Rome later reversed after Offa died. Faith followed politics. Offa attended church councils at Chelsea in 785 and 789 that legislated for tithes and baptism. Offa spoke to Europe. Charlemagne, king of the Franks and later emperor, treated Offa as an equal in letters that survive. In 796, Charlemagne wrote to Offa about merchants, pilgrims, and a proposed marriage alliance that never happened. The letter complains that Mercian merchants were selling cloaks that were too short, that English pilgrims needed protection in Frankish territory, and that Offa's coins should be of good weight, which shows that English trade was important enough for the most powerful ruler in the West to care about the length of a sleeve. That was new status. No earlier English king had been addressed by a continental ruler as a brother. Alcuin carried many letters. Alcuin of York, who lived at Charlemagne's court in Aachen, wrote to Offa and to his successor and to English bishops. He warned Offa about pride, praised his learning, and asked for alms for English churches. In one letter, Alcuin reminded Offa that kings are judged not by gold, but by justice, which suggests that even admirers saw in Offa a ruler whose ambition needed restraint, because Mercian power had grown so quickly that only a Frankish scholar who knew both courts dared to speak so plainly. Offa listened sometimes. He sent gifts to Rome and to Frankish churches and endowed St. Albans Abbey in memory of the British martyr. Offa built in stone. At Brixworth in Northamptonshire, a large basilican church with arches of Roman brick shows Mercian ambition in ecclesiastical architecture. The church reused Roman tiles and had a crypt that allowed pilgrims to walk around relics. Such buildings required skilled masons who worked with mortar that set hard, with glass windows imported through London, and with timber scaffolding that rose higher than any hall roof, which indicates that Mercia could draw on craftsmen from Kent and Francia who would not have traveled for a minor chief. Stone stayed after timber burned. Brixworth still stands, its arches visible above later plaster. Mercia controlled resources others lacked. Salt from dryage was essential for preserving meat and was taxed by the king. Iron from the Forest of Dean made tools and weapons, and pottery from Stamford and Ipswich moved along rivers under toll. Charters record grants of land measured in hides, each hide enough to support a family, and Offa's administration counted those hides to assess how many men should be sent to build the dike or to guard London, which turned the landscape itself into a document that could be read by clerks. That counting was power. It allowed Mercia to act like a state rather than a collection of war bands. Offa died in 796. His son Ecgfrith, consecrated as king during Offa's lifetime in imitation of Frankish practice, died after only 141 days. The dynasty collapsed because Offa had killed or exiled potential rivals and left no adult heir with support. Within a generation, Wessex under Ecgbert would replace Mercia as the dominant southern power, but the administrative habits Offa had taught of minting good coins, writing boundary clauses in English, and holding councils at Chelsea and Clofesho survived into the next century and were copied by kings who had once paid him tribute. The century ended with Mercia tired. Its fields were still rich, its dikes still marked a frontier, but its kings no longer spoke to Charlemagne as brothers. Mercian power faded slowly. Cenwulf, who ruled from 796 to 821, held Kent and East Anglia again and patronized Winchcombe Abbey. He fought in Wales, corresponded with the Pope, and kept the Lichfield experiment alive until 803, when Rome restored Canterbury's primacy. Yet even Cenwulf could not recreate the concentration of trade, coin, and labor that Offa had managed, because Wessex was growing stronger in the south, and because a new pressure from the sea, first felt at Lindisfarne in 793, would soon demand ships and silver rather than dikes and charters. The age shifted. Mercia had taught England how to be governed, but it would not govern England itself. The Mercian century left earthworks. Offa's Dyke, Watt's Dyke, and the bounds of estates still traceable on modern maps remain. Charters with Old English clauses gave English a written form that would survive Viking wars. When later kings like Alfred looked back for models of Christian kingship that combined war, law, and building, they found Offa already there, a ruler who had tried to make a kingdom of many peoples speak with one coin and one boundary, even if that unity proved too heavy for his own family to hold. The dike still holds shadow. The bank remains, grassed over, holding its line through winter. Chapter 6 Fire from the North. On 8 June 793 men came from the sea. They landed on Lindisfarne, the holy island where Aidan and Cuthbert had prayed, and burned what they could carry. Monks were killed, some were drowned, and the relics were stripped of gold and silver. Alcuin, writing from Aachen to King Aethelred of Northumbria, said that such an attack had never been seen in Britain, that the church of St. Cuthbert was spattered with blood, and that the disaster must be read as divine punishment for sins that included vanity and greed among the Northumbrian elite. The shock was literary as well as physical. Lindisfarne's fame made its violation a story told across Francia and Ireland. The attackers were Norwegians and Danes. They came from coasts where land was scarce and where ships had become the best tool for both trade and war. Their longships were clinker built, shallow drafted, and could sail or row 50 miles in a day. Those ships carried men who knew the tidal creeks of eastern England as well as they knew the fjords of home, because Scandinavian merchants had been visiting York and Ipswich for generations, exchanging amber and furs for silver and wool, and because that trade had taught them where monasteries stored wealth without walls to protect it. Raiding was seasonal at first. Crews came in summer, took slaves and silver, and returned home before winter storms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle first recorded Vikings in 7089. 3 ships landed at Portland in Dorset, and the local reeve rode to meet them thinking they were traders. The Chronicle said they killed him, the first Englishman to die at Viking hands. After Lindisfarne came attacks at Jarrow in 794, at Iona where monks were killed in 802 and 806, and along the Kentish coast in the 830s, when the Chronicle began to record almost annual raids that forced Wessex kings to muster shire levies and to fight battles at places like Carhampton in 836 where Egbert of Wessex was defeated. Defense was local then. Kings met raids with fyrds that disbanded after harvest and could not hold the coast through winter. In 865, the scale changed. The Chronicle recorded that a great heathen army, Mycel heathen here in Old English, landed in East Anglia. Its leaders were called sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary figure whose historicity is less important than his son's impact. Among them were Ivar, whom later sagas called the Boneless, and whom some scholars think had a disability that did not prevent command, Halfdan, who would become king in York, and Guthrum, who would fight Alfred for the future of Wessex, and together they brought not a summer raid, but an army that intended to stay and divide kingdoms. East Anglia bought peace. The army took horses and marched north toward York, where Northumbria was already divided by civil war. York fell on 1 November 866. The city had Roman walls, but no united defense, because rival kings Osbert and El fought each other as much as the invaders. The Chronicle said the Danes killed many Northumbrians inside and outside the walls. In 867, the Northumbrians attempted to retake York, forcing entry and then being trapped inside, where both Osbert and Ale were killed, and where the defeat ended an independent Northumbrian kingdom that had ruled from the Forth to the Humber since the days of Edwin and Oswald. Northumbria became a Danish kingdom. Halfdan settled his men and ruled from York, while English ealdormen held parts of the north as clients. The army moved south. In 869 it returned to East Anglia, where King Edmund, a young Christian king, refused to renounce his faith or to rule as a client. Later accounts, written to make a saint, said Edmund was tied to a tree and shot with arrows. The earliest source, the Chronicle, said simply that the army rode across Mercia into East Anglia and took winter quarters at Thetford, where they killed Edmund, whose body was later venerated at Bury St. Edmunds, and whose cult gave East Anglia a Christian hero who died at pagan hands, which helped turn defeat into a story of endurance. Martyrdom made loss memorable. East Anglia became a Danish kingdom under Guthrum's influence, its churches taxed but not destroyed. Wessex was next. In 870, the army entered Wessex under Bagsec and Halfdan, and King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred met them repeatedly. 9 battles were fought in 871, a year Bede's successors would remember as the year of battles. At Ashdown on 8 January 871, Alfred fought while Ethelred prayed in his tent, according to Asser, and the West Saxons won a sharp victory that killed Bagseg, though the victory did not stop the Danes from taking winter quarters at Reading and from forcing Wessex to pay tribute after losses at Basing and Meriton. Aethelred died in April 871. Alfred, aged 21, became king of a kingdom that had paid Danes and still faced their army. The winter of 878 was Alfred's nadir. Guthrum, who had become king of East Anglia, made a surprise attack on Chippenham where Alfred held court at Christmas. The Chronicle said most of Alfred's people submitted, and Alfred himself fled with a small warband into the marshes. Asser, Alfred's biographer who knew him later, described the king living in the Somerset levels, moving between Athelney and the woods, unable to hold a hall because Guthrum's men controlled the royal vills and the roads that connected them, and because many ealdormen thought Wessex was finished as a kingdom. Later legend added cakes. That story, first recorded long after Alfred's death, shows how memory turned hardship into moral lesson rather than record. Spring changed everything. In May 878, Alfred summoned men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to Egbert's Stone near Selwood Forest. 3 days later, they fought Guthrum at Eddington in Wiltshire and won a decisive victory. The Danes retreated to Chippenham, were besieged for 2 weeks, and agreed to terms that required Guthrum to leave Wessex, to be baptized as a Christian, and to accept Alfred as godfather, which bound the two kings in a spiritual kinship that made breaking peace a sin as well as a political failure. Guthrum was baptized as Aethelstan. He held East Anglia as a Christian king under Alfred's overlordship, minting coins with both names. The treaty defined a boundary. A later agreement, sometimes called the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, drew a line along the Thames, then up the Lea to Bedford, then up the Ouse to Watling Street. East of that line was Danish law. West of it was English law, enforced by Alfred and his successors from Wessex. The eastern area became known as the Danelaw, where Danish custom, language, and landholding shaped daily life. Within it 5 towns, Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford, became fortified centers called the 5 Boroughs. Danelaw society left traces. Hundreds were called wopentakes, a word meaning weapon taking, because men voted by clashing weapons in assembly. Free farmers called sokemen held land with rights that were broader than those of many English ceorls further south. Place names ending in by meaning village and thorp meaning secondary settlement like Grimsby and Scunthorpe, cluster densely in the Danelaw, which shows that Danish settlers renamed or founded hamlets where English names had been, and that their language remained spoken in fields and markets for generations after baptism. Law was spoken in two tongues. Charters from the 10th century record Danes and English swearing oaths together in courts that used both traditions. York flourished under Danish rule. Excavations at Coppergate uncovered workshops where amber, jet, and silver were worked side by side. Combs, coins, and silk fragments found there came from Norway, Frisia, and Byzantium, showing a trading network wider than Wessex could yet command. That trade was protected by walls that Halfdan and his successors repaired, because a town that could not be defended could not collect tolls, and because Danish kings needed silver to pay warriors and to mint pennies that copied Alfred's but bore their own names and symbols. Towns grew from fear. Fear built markets as well as walls. Religion marked difference. Danish settlers arrived pagan, swearing by Thor's hammer and burying weapons with their dead. Stone crosses in Yorkshire, carved with both Christian scenes and scenes from Ragnarok, show the blending that followed conversion. At Gosforth, a cross 10 feet high depicts Christ crucified alongside Vidar fighting Fenrir, which suggests that local sculptors explained new faith through old stories, because a farmer who knew Thor could understand Christ as a stronger protector rather than as an entirely new kind of God. Conversion was political. Baptism allowed Danish kings to marry English women, to grant land to churches, and to rule without constant rebellion. Wessex survived by learning. Alfred built a system of fortified towns called burhs, 33 of them recorded in the Burgal Hittite. Each burh was placed within a day's march of another, so that no village was more than 20 miles from refuge. The system required that every hide of land provide one man for wall duty, and that townsmen maintain timber revetments and gates, which meant that Alfred's administration had to count hides more carefully than any Mercian king had done before, and to keep lists that survive as some of the earliest English bureaucratic documents. Walls were work. They were also markets, mints, and places where law could be enforced under the king's peace. Mercia broke under pressure. In 874, the great army drove Burgred of Mercia into exile in Rome, where he died. Ceolwulf II, an Englishman who ruled as a client of the Danes, held western Mercia while the army divided eastern Mercia among its men. That division shows how Danish settlement differed from earlier raids, because warriors who had fought for 10 years now measured land with ropes, allocated plow teams, and brought wives or took English wives, which turned an army camp into villages that paid rent rather than tribute. Wessex alone remained independent. Its survival depended on Alfred's ability to keep his ealdormen together through defeat and through victory. Settlement changed the map. In Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, Danish personal names appear in charters alongside English ones within a generation. Men called Thor and Grim became neighbors to men called Wulfstan and Adric, and their children intermarried. Domesday Book, compiled 2 centuries later, still records sokemen and freemen in the Danelaw in numbers far higher than in Wessex, which reflects a society where land had been divided among many warriors rather than concentrated in the hands of a few great lords who could command labor. Language kept the memory. Words like law, sky, and egg entered English from Old Norse during this period. By 880, England was divided. Alfred held Wessex and western Mercia through his son-in-law Aethelred, while Guthrum held East Anglia and the eastern Midlands. Northumbria remained Danish under Halfdan's successors, its archbishop still at York, but under a pagan king's protection. That division, though born of defeat, created a frontier that forced Alfred to build a state more organized than any before, with a navy, a list of forts, and a program of translation that aimed to give Englishmen books in their own tongue, because he believed that learning had failed before the Vikings came, and that wisdom was needed as much as walls. Defeat taught administration. Alfred's England would be shaped by that lesson more than by any single battle. The North had burned. Lindisfarne's monks carried Cuthbert's body from place to place, seeking safety, their wooden reliquary worn smooth by hands. Churches that had stood for a century were thatched again or left roofless, their stone reused for walls. Yet in York, where Danes now walked the same streets as English, new houses rose on the same plots, new coins were struck with Thor's hammer and Christ's cross on opposite sides, and a generation grew up that spoke both languages, which meant that the fire from the north had not ended England, but had forced it to become something it had never been before. The shore stayed watched. And in Wessex, lists of forts were being copied onto parchment for the next season. Chapter 7: Alfred and the Idea of England. After Eddington, Alfred had room to build. He ruled Wessex from 871 to 899, a reign longer than any recent West Saxon king. The kingdom he inherited was the last English kingdom free of Danish kings, and it was exhausted by tribute and war. Alfred understood that survival required more than victory in a single battle, because Guthrum had been beaten but not destroyed, because other Danish armies still held York and Lincoln, and because Wessex alone could not field enough men each spring unless those men knew where to gather and what they were defending. He began with forts. Forts made time, and time allowed law and books to return. Alfred was the youngest son. He was born in 849 at Wantage, the fifth son of Aethelwulf, king of Wessex. As a child, he went to Rome twice, once in 853 and again in 855, and saw a city that still kept Roman walls and papal ceremony, and that taught a boy from Wessex what a capital might look like. Those trips marked him. He later remembered being given a book of English poems by his mother Osber when he learned to read. Asser said he learned to read English before Latin, and that he loved hunting and poetry equally. Wessex kingship passed between brothers. Aethelbald, Aethelbert, and Aethelred ruled in quick succession, each fighting Danes and each dying young. When Aethelred died after Easter 871, Alfred was 21 and already experienced in battle. He inherited a kingdom that had paid tribute to Danes, that had lost its northern and eastern neighbors, and that relied on ealdormen who expected to be consulted before they marched, which meant that kingship depended on persuasion as much as command, and that a young king needed to prove he could keep his word and his wall. Alfred learned that quickly. His first year was a series of fights and negotiations that ended with payment to the Danes. We know Alfred better than any earlier king. That is because of Asser, a Welsh monk from St. David's, who joined Alfred's court around 885. Asser wrote a life of King Alfred, modeled on Einhard's life of Charlemagne, mixing chronicle with personal observation. Asser described Alfred's illnesses, his love of books, his habit of carrying a small wax tablet to note ideas, and his frustration that his ealdorman could not read Latin, which gives a portrait more intimate than any charter list, and which has made Alfred feel closer than his predecessors who remain names on coins. The book is flawed. It stops in 893 and survives only in copies, but its voice remains unusually personal. Asser met Alfred at Sussex. Alfred asked him to leave Wales and teach at court, and Asser hesitated because he did not want to abandon his own monastery. They agreed that Asser would spend half the year in Wessex and half in Wales, a compromise that shows how personal such arrangements were. Asser later described reading aloud to Alfred in a chamber, translating Latin into English as he went, while Alfred listened and interrupted with questions about meaning, because Alfred wanted not just the words, but the sense that lay behind them, and because that habit of questioning would become the basis for his program of translation. Learning was conversation. It happened in rooms with firelight and wax tablets, not in abstract decrees. Alfred reformed war. He divided the fyrd into two parts, one in the field and one at home tending crops. That way a force was always available without stripping farms at harvest. He also ordered the building of burhs, fortified centers whose walls were of earth and timber fronted with stone where possible, whose garrisons were drawn from surrounding hides, and whose placement allowed men to reach safety within a day's march from any village in Wessex. The system required counting. Every hide was assessed, every man assigned, and every wall measured in poles. The Burgle Hidage records that work. It is a document from the early 10th century that lists 33 burhs and the hides assigned to each. Winchester was assigned 2,400 hides, Wallingford the same, while smaller places like Ling received only 100. Those figures show that Alfred and his advisors calculated how many men were needed to man a wall based on its length, allowing one man per pole, which turns the landscape of Wessex into a ledger where every village knew how many feet of wall it was responsible for, and where royal power could be measured in timber and ditch. Administration became visible. Men who had never seen the king saw his work in the bank outside their town. Alfred also wrote law. He compiled a Dombock, a doom book, that began with the Ten Commandments and included laws from Ethelbert, Ine, and Opha. The book was not a complete code, but a selection meant to show how Christian justice should temper old custom. In its introduction, Alfred argued that law had come from Moses to Christ to English kings, which placed his own judgments within a divine history, and which allowed him to present Wergild and oath helpers not as pagan survivals, but as part of a Christian order that required mercy as well as punishment. Judges were told to be just. Asser said Alfred checked their judgments and threatened removal if they were unjust or illiterate. Alfred worried about learning. In a letter to Bishop Werforth, he wrote that learning had decayed so badly that few south of the Humber could read Latin. He blamed both Viking raids and earlier complacency, noting that churches once full of books now had empty shelves. That lament was not mere rhetoric, because book production had indeed fallen, because many monasteries had been burned or abandoned, and because the clerks who survived often memorized liturgy without understanding the grammar behind it, which meant that the kingdom could not produce the priests and judges it needed. He set out to repair it. He gathered scholars from Mercia, Wales, and Francia to his court to teach. Translation was central. Alfred decided that the books most necessary for men to know should be turned into English. He himself translated Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Augustine's Soliloquies, and the first part of Orosius's History. In Boethius, Alfred added passages about his own kingship, about wisdom as the highest power, and about the need to leave behind a reputation for good works, which shows how he read old philosophy not as antiquarian exercise, but as advice for ruling a kingdom that had almost been lost. Books went to bishops. Each copy of the Pastoral Care was sent with a golden pointer worth 50 mancuses, telling bishops to learn. One pointer survives. The Alfred jewel, found in 1693 near Athelney in Somerset, is a gold and enamel object inscribed "Alfred had me made." It held a rock crystal lens over a figure that may be sight itself, symbolizing wisdom. The jewel was attached to a slender rod that fit a hand, and its craftsmanship, with gold wire and cloisonné enamel, shows that Alfred's court could employ goldsmiths of exceptional skill who worked for a king who wanted his name linked not to war alone, but to learning that could be held and seen. It was found near his refuge. That marshy ground, where Alfred had hidden in 878, later yielded the object that defined his reign. Alfred reformed coinage and ships. He restored the weight of the penny and had London and Winchester strike coins with his portrait and the title Rex Saxonum. He also ordered longer ships with 60 oars, built to fight Viking longships in coastal waters. Asser said those ships were swifter and steadier than Danish ships, though the chronicle recorded that they sometimes ran aground because they were too large for shallow estuaries, which shows that Alfred's experiments did not always succeed, but that he was willing to try new technology rather than rely only on old habit. Trade returned slowly. London, refortified in 886, became a port again under Alfred's control, its tolls funding walls. Family secured the future. Alfred married Ealhswith, daughter of a Mercian noble, linking Wessex and Mercia by marriage as well as by war. His daughter Ethelflaed married Ethelred of Mercia, who ruled western Mercia as ealdorman under Alfred's overlordship. His son Edward, later called the Elder, was trained in arms and letters, hunting and reading, because Alfred believed that a king should know both sword and book, and because that combination would be needed to hold together a kingdom that included both English and Danish peoples who spoke different laws. Succession was planned. Alfred left Edward well supported by ealdormen who had sworn to uphold his kingship. Alfred used new language. He spoke of angel sin, the English people, a term that included Mercians and West Saxons under one name. He called his realm England in some charters, a word that would become England. That idea was political as well as cultural because it allowed a Mercian thing to see service to a West Saxon king, not as submission to a foreign ruler, but as loyalty to a common people who shared language, Christianity, and a past that Alfred's translations were constructing from Bede and from older chronicles. Identity needed words. Alfred gave it words that outlasted his forts and ships. Alfred dealt with neighbors. Welsh kings from Gwynedd and Dyfed acknowledged his overlordship around 885 and sought protection against Mercian and Danish pressure. Guthrum, baptized as Aethelstan, kept East Anglia until his death in 890, observing the boundary agreed at Wedmore. That boundary allowed trade and even settlement across it, because English and Danish farmers used the same plows and the same markets, and because Alfred's peace, enforced by burrs and by oaths, gave both sides a reason to keep the peace rather than to test whether Wessex could be taken again. Peace was maintained. It held until new fleets arrived in the 890s that Alfred's ships and forts had to meet again. Alfred died on 26 October 899. He was about 50, worn by illness that Acer described as painful and recurrent, perhaps Crohn's disease. He was buried at Winchester, first in the Old Minster and later moved to New Minster and then to Hyde Abbey. His bones were scattered during later building work, so no grave can be visited with certainty today, which is fitting for a king whose real monuments were not barrows, but lists of forts, translations of books, and a word for a people that outlived any single burial place. Winchester remained his city. Its walls, repaired under his orders, still enclose streets that follow his burh plan. Later centuries made Alfred legendary. By the 12th century, William of Malmesbury called him the most famous of English kings. Victorian writers turned him into a model of English industriousness, inventing the cakes and the burning that never appeared in Asser. That mythologizing obscured his harder achievements, which were less picturesque than burnt cakes, but more durable, because counting hides, translating Boethius, and building burrs that could be held through winter required daily labor rather than a single moment of inspiration, and because that daily labor is harder to celebrate than a sudden victory. The work endured. Wessex, Mercia, and later Northumbria would be governed using tools Alfred had sharpened. The jewel still catches light. In the Ashmolean Museum, its enamel glows blue and green under glass, its inscription clear after 11 centuries. It is small, fitting a palm, made to point at words rather than to cut. That small object, found near the marsh where a king once hid among reeds and fishermen, carries more of Alfred's idea than any statue, because it links a name, a book, and a hope that Englishmen might be wise as well as brave, even when winter came early and ships appeared off the coast. The marsh is still wet. Reeds still bend over water that once hid a king and his book. Chapter 8: The Making of England. Edward succeeded his father in 899. He was about 25, trained in war, and already trusted with command in the marshes of Somerset. His cousin Aethelwold, son of Aethelred, challenged the succession and allied with Danes in Northumbria and East Anglia. Aethelwold's revolt ended in 902 at the Battle of the Holm, where he and a Danish king were killed, which left Edward secure in Wessex and free to turn his attention to the Danelaw that Alfred had never been able to conquer but had taught his son how to take. He built on Alfred's work. Burrs, fyrds, and tribute became tools for conquest rather than mere defense. Conquest was a family project. Edward worked with his sister Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, who ruled western Mercia after her husband Ethelred's illness and death. Together they built a chain of burrs that pressed northward, Edward from the south and Aethelflaed from the west. Between 910 and 920 they took Chester, which Ethelflaed refortified, Derby in 917, and Leicester in 918, which meant that the five boroughs that had been centers of Danish power began to fall one by one, because each burgh provided a secure base for food and men that allowed the next advance to be made without abandoning ground. The chronicle recorded each taking. Its entries for those years read like a ledger of forts and submissions. Edward was methodical. He did not seek a single decisive battle, but a series of sieges that wore down Danish resistance. At Bedford, at Stamford, and at Nottingham, his men built burhs that overlooked rivers and roads. When Danish leaders surrendered, Edward required oaths, hostages, and baptism where needed, and he settled English farmers on land that had been measured again, which turned conquest into administration rather than mere plunder, and which gave his clerks the high assessments that later kings would use. By 920 he held the south. In that year, the chronicle said that kings of Scots, Strathclyde, and York chose him as father and lord. Aethelflaed deserves close attention. She was born around 870, eldest child of Alfred, educated at court, and married to Aethelred of Mercia for alliance. When Ethelred became ill after 902, she led Mercian armies and built burhs at Bridnorth, Tamworth, and Stafford. In 909 she took Derby, where she lost 4 Thegs who were dear to her according to the Mercian register, and then Leicester, and before her death in June 909 at Tamworth, she had received the submission of York, which shows that a Mercian lady could command loyalty from both English and Danish Thegs, who trusted her justice more than they feared Wessex. She died at Tamworth. Edward then took direct control of Mercia, ending its separate ealdormanry and joining it to Wessex. Edward died in 9224. He was campaigning against a Mercian and Welsh rebellion when illness took him at Farndon on Dee. His son Aethelstan, born around 894 to Egwin, a wife of lower status, was chosen by Mercians as king first. Aethelstan had been raised in Mercia by Aethelflaed and Aethelred, which gave him Mercian support that his half-brother Elfweird, who died weeks after Edward, lacked, and which meant that his coronation at Kingston in September 925 was as much Mercian as West Saxon in its audience. Kingston mattered. Its church lay on the Thames border between Wessex and Mercia, a place both peoples could reach. Aethelstan ruled 15 years. He completed what Edward had begun and made a kingdom that stretched from Cornwall to Northumbria. In 927 he took York, ending the Scandinavian kingdom there, and received submission of Welsh and Scottish kings at Emont Bridge. Charters from his reign call him Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, and Rex Anglorum, King of the English, which were titles no earlier king had dared to use consistently, because they claimed an authority that went beyond Wessex and Mercia, and that included peoples who still spoke different laws and kept different customs. He legislated and collected. His law codes regulated coinage, theft, and the age at which a thief could be executed. Brunanburh tested that claim. In 937, Olaf Guthfrithson, King of Dublin and York, Constantine II of Scotland, and Owain of Strathclyde allied against Aethelstan. They led a large army, perhaps drawn from Norse settlements in Ireland and the Isle of Man, into England. Aethelstan met them at Brunanburh, a place whose exact location is still debated, but which was probably in the northwest, and there his army, including Mercians and West Saxons fighting together, won a victory so complete that the Chronicle and later sagas remembered it as a battle where 5 young kings and 7 earls of the enemy died. The victory secured England. No coalition of Scots, Britons, and Norse would challenge English kingship so directly again for a generation. A poem records the battle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle included a heroic poem in Old English that praised Aethelstan and his brother Edmund for their victory. It said the English left behind the Mercians and West Saxons rejoicing, while the Scots and Norsemen fled in ships over the sea. That poem, composed close to events, shows how a new English identity was being sung into existence, because it called the fallen Norse weary with wounds, and the English kin of Edward, which placed Brunanburh in a lineage that stretched from Alfred through Edward to Aethelstan, and which gave a northern battle a southern audience. Poetry made politics memorable. Men who could not read charters could remember alliterative lines about kings and swords. Aethelstan governed with documents. His charters were written by a scribe known as Aethelstan A, who used elaborate Latin and long boundary clauses. He collected relics, received gifts from continental rulers, and married his sisters to Ottonian and Frankish princes. One sister married Otto, who became Holy Roman Emperor, which meant that an English king who had taken York with spears could also talk to Aachen with kinship, and that English silver pennies began to be found in Scandinavian hoards, because continental trade followed dynastic marriage as surely as it followed war. He died in 939. His kingdom stretched further than any English king before him had ruled, and it held. His brother Edmund succeeded. Edmund, aged 18, faced immediate revolt in York and the Five Boroughs, which had accepted Aethelstan but not his successor. By 944, Edmund retook the Five Boroughs, and a poem praised him for freeing Danes who had been under Norse rule. That distinction mattered because Edmund presented himself not as a conqueror of foreigners, but as a liberator of English Danes who had lived in England for a generation and who preferred Christian English law to Norse warlordship, which shows how the Danelaw was becoming less Danish and more English with each decade. Edmund was murdered in 946. He was stabbed at Pucklechurch by an outlaw named Leofa while trying to protect his steward. Edred followed Edmund. He suffered from illness that Bede's successors described as a wasting disease that made eating painful. Despite that, he completed the reconquest of York in 954 when Eric Bloodaxe, last Scandinavian king of York, was expelled and killed. Edred's death in 955 left the kingdom to Eadwig, a boy of about 15 whose short reign was marked by quarrel with Dunstan and by the division of England between Wessex under Eadwig and Mercia under his brother Edgar, which shows that unity still depended on adult kingship and on the cooperation of churchmen who could keep records and counsel restraint. Eadwig died in 959. Edgar, already king in Mercia, became king of all England without bloodshed. Edgar's reign was remembered as peaceful. The Chronicle said that in his days there was peace and law, and that no fleet dared attack England. He reorganized shires, standardized coinage, and kept a fleet that patrolled the coast. In 973, Edgar was crowned at Bath in a ceremony devised by Dunstan that combined anointing, crowning, and oath taking, which created a model for all later English coronations and which linked kingship to priestly blessing in a way that made rebellion not only treason but sacrilege. Bath was Roman and Christian. Its hot springs and ruined temple gave Edgar's coronation a sense of ancient authority renewed. 3 churchmen shaped Edgar's church: Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, Ethelwold, Bishop of Winchester, and Oswald, Bishop of Worcester and later Archbishop of York, led a Benedictine reform. They wanted monks to live by the rule of Benedict, not by local custom, and to be free from lay control. That meant expelling secular clerks who married and owned property from cathedrals at Winchester, Worcester, and Canterbury, and replacing them with monks who prayed the hours together, who kept stricter fasts, and who copied books in a hand that became known as English Caroline minuscule, which made charters and liturgy more legible. Reform was political. Edgar supported it because monks who prayed for the king and who held land by charter strengthened royal authority. Dunstan is the most vivid. Born near Glastonbury around 909, he became a monk, a goldsmith, and a politician who served 4 kings. At Glastonbury, he rebuilt the abbey, taught boys to read, and was said to have worked iron with his own hands. Later stories told how he seized the devil's nose with red-hot tongs while working at his forge, which turned a skilled craftsman into a folk hero because people remembered a monk who could work metal and who was not afraid to quarrel with kings, and because such stories made monastic reform feel brave rather than merely bureaucratic. He died in 988. By then, his pupils held bishoprics across England, spreading his model of monastic life. The reform produced books. Around 970, Aethelwald and Dunstan issued the Regularis Concordia, a rule for how English monasteries should live and pray together. It prescribed identical hours, identical vestments, and prayers for the king and queen at every service. That uniformity meant that a monk traveling from Abingdon to Ely would find the same psalms at the same hour, which made the kingdom feel smaller and more ordered, and which linked monastic discipline to royal power because monks who prayed for Edgar by name made his rule present in every choir. Lands followed reform. Edgar gave monasteries estates that had been held by laymen, increasing their wealth and their ability to copy books. Edgar reformed coinage. In the 970s, his moneyers issued a new portrait penny that was uniform across England. Every few years, the dies were recalled and recoined, which prevented clipping and allowed the king to take a profit. That reform required mints in 40 or more towns, each with moneyers who were responsible for weight and fineness, which turned coin into a royal message that reached every market, because a peasant who handled a penny with Edgar's face knew whose peace protected his transaction, even if he never saw Winchester. Trade grew under that peace. Wool, tin, and slaves moved through ports that paid tolls to a single king. By 975, England was a kingdom. Shires with reeves, hundreds with courts, and burghs with markets formed a system that stretched from the Channel to the Tees. Edgar's coronation at Bath had shown that a king could be anointed for all English, not just for Wessex or Mercia. The Benedictine reform had given that kingdom a literate clergy who wrote in a standardized Old English, who kept annals that called Edgar peaceable, and who preserved Bede and Alfred's translations in libraries that survived because they were housed in stone rather than timber. The making seemed complete. Yet the same system that made England wealthy also made it worth taking, and new ships were already on northern seas. Edgar was buried at Glastonbury. Dunstan had restored its abbey, and Edgar had endowed it with lands taken from less reformist houses. When his bones were moved in later centuries, monks claimed they still smelled sweet, a sign of sanctity. That story, like the reform itself, mixed piety and politics, because a saintly king made his successors seem holier, and because an abbey that held a king's body could claim protection from laymen who might otherwise take its fields. Stone held the memory. At Bath, the hot water still rises where Edgar was crowned, steaming in winter air. Chapter 9: Renewal and Rot. Edgar died in 975. He was 32, and his sons Edward and Ethelred were 10 and about 7. Edward, later called the Martyr, ruled 3 years before he was murdered at Corfe in 978 by servants of his stepmother Elfrith. Ethelred, his half-brother, was crowned at Kingston at about 10 years old, which meant that counselors like Dunstan, Aethelwold, and Queen Mother Elfrith governed for him, and which meant that his later nickname, Unread, meaning ill-counseled rather than unready, pointed to advice more than to character. Peace ended quickly. The system Edgar had built needed strong hands, and a child could not provide them. Raids returned in the 980s. Small fleets attacked Southampton in 980, Thanet in 979, and Cheshire in 980, testing defenses that had not been needed for a generation. In 991, a larger force led by Olaf Tryggvason landed in Essex and moved up the Blackwater estuary. There, Ealdorman Burstnoth of Essex, an old man who had served Edgar, led the East Saxon Fyrd to the causeway at Malden, where he allowed the Vikings to cross rather than hold the narrow ford, because pride and custom demanded open battle rather than a defensive stand that might have saved lives but not honor. Burtnot fell. His men stood, some fled, and the Vikings took victory and plunder. A poem remembered Malden. The Battle of Malden, written in Old English soon after, described Burtnoth's pride and his Theg's loyalty. It placed speeches in the mouths of warriors who said they would avenge their lord or die beside him. That poem survives only as a fragment, its beginning and end lost in the fire that burned the Cotton Library in 1731, yet it remains the clearest voice of the Anglo-Saxon warrior ethic because it values loyalty over survival, and because it was copied by monks who saw in Berfnoth's defeat a moral lesson about overconfidence as much as a record of loss. Poetry preserved defeat. Defeat was becoming common again, and common defeat needed explaining in old terms. After Malden, the council chose tribute. Archbishop Sigric of Canterbury advised that silver should be given to the Danes to buy peace. In 991, 10,000 pounds of silver were paid. In 994, 16,000, and in 10,002, 24,000. Those sums were raised by taxing hides, which meant that every village had to produce coin or be stripped of cattle, and which meant that the same administrative skill that Edgar had used to make a uniform penny now served to empty chests into Danish hands, because the chronicle recorded each payment with grim precision. Tribute bought time. It did not buy peace, because each payment showed how much wealth England held. The fleets grew larger. In 994, Olaf Tryggvason and Svein Forkbeard, king of Denmark, brought 94 ships to London and were repulsed only by its walls. Aethelred then made peace with Olaf, who was baptized and promised never to attack England again, a promise he kept. Svein did not keep peace because Danish kings needed English silver to pay their own warriors, and because England's wealth, recorded in hidage and coin, made it a target that could not be ignored once tribute had proved that English kings would pay rather than fight. Aethelred tried another plan. In Tenzone II, he ordered the killing of Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, 13 November. The massacre left evidence. At Oxford, Danes fled to St. Friedwide's church, and townsmen burned the church with them inside. A charter of Millionsian IV said Ethelred rebuilt the church because Danes had been driven there and killed. In 2008, archaeologists at St. John's College, Oxford, found a mass grave of 34 or 35 young Scandinavian men, their bones showing weapon trauma, their radiocarbon dates clustering around 1,000, which suggests that this pit may hold victims of the St. Brice's Day killing, and which shows that Ethelred's order was carried out with brutal thoroughness. Among them was a sister of Svein. Her death, if the tradition is true, gave Svein personal motive for conquest as well as financial reason. Svein returned with an army. In 1013 he led a fleet that took Sandwich, then marched through Wessex and Mercia, receiving submission as he went. London held out under Aethelred and Thurkel, a Danish mercenary who had entered English service. Svein bypassed London, went north to the Danelaw where Danish settlers welcomed him as a kinsman rather than an invader, and by December the chronicle said that all the nation considered him as full king, because English ealdormen saw that Ethelred's counsel had failed, and because Svein's army could live off the land through winter without needing English permission. Aethelred fled. He went to the Isle of Wight, then to Normandy where his wife Emma and their sons lived in exile. Emma was central. Daughter of Richard I of Normandy, she had married Aethelred in Tensionen II to seal an alliance against Viking fleets using Norman ports. Her marriage brought Norman clerks and Norman ships into English politics, and her children would link England to Normandy in ways no one yet foresaw. When Svein took England, Emma took her sons Edward and Alfred to Normandy under the protection of her brother Richard II, which meant that for the first time an English queen in exile kept a court that could claim the English throne from across the Channel, and that Norman dukes learned to think of England as a place where their kin might rule. Exile preserved claims. It also taught Edward, her son, Norman French and Norman customs that would later shape English politics. Svein died suddenly. On 3 February 1014, 5 weeks after taking England, he died at Gainsborough, perhaps from a fall or a stroke. His army chose his son Canute, then about 18, as king, but English ealdormen invited Ethelred back. Ethelred returned after promising to be a better lord, which the chronicle recorded as a formal agreement that he would rule more justly, and Canute was driven out, sailing to Denmark with hostages whose hands and noses he cut off, because mutilation was a message that his return would be less merciful than his departure. England had a brief reprieve. Ethelred died in April 1016, while Canute was again campaigning in Wessex. Edmund Ironside fought Canute. Son of Ethelred by his first wife, Edmund was elected king in London, while Canute was chosen at Southampton. The year 1016 saw 5 battles at Penselwood, Shurston, Brentford, Utford, and Assendoun, the last decisive. At Assendoun on 18 October 1016, Adric Striona, ealdorman of Mercia, whose loyalty had shifted many times, betrayed Edmund and left the field, and Canute won a victory that gave him Mercia and Northumbria, while Edmund kept Wessex because both armies were too exhausted to continue fighting through another winter. They met at Olney. There they divided England, Edmund taking Wessex and Canute taking the north, until one of them died. Edmund died on 30 November 1016. He was about 26, and his death left Canute king of all England without further battle. Canute moved quickly to secure his throne, marrying Emma, widow of Ethelred, in 1017. That marriage linked him to the old dynasty, protected Emma's sons in Normandy by making her sons with Canute the heirs of the new regime, and gave Canute a queen who knew English administration and who could read Latin charters that he was still learning to understand, because Canute was a Dane who had to learn to rule as an English king. He also removed rivals. Edric Striona was executed in 1017, and other English ealdormen were killed or exiled to clear the way. Canute ruled as an English king. He issued laws in English, upheld Edgar's coinage reform, and divided England into 4 great earldoms. Wessex he kept himself, East Anglia went to Thurkel, Mercia to Adric and later Leofric, Northumbria to Eric of Hlethir. Those earldoms were governed by men who commanded armies and collected taxes, which meant that Canute delegated power to trusted Scandinavians and to Englishmen who had submitted early, and which meant that his kingdom looked more like Edgar's than like Svein's, because he kept shire courts and hundred courts and wrote charters in the same Old English that Alfred had promoted. Law continued. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which had lamented tribute, recorded peace under Canute without irony. Canute cultivated the church. He gave gifts to Winchester, Canterbury, and Bury St. Edmunds, where Edmund the Martyr's shrine benefited from royal patronage. In 1027, he traveled to Rome for the coronation of Emperor Conrad II and wrote a letter to his English subjects. That letter, which survives in several copies, said that Canute had gone to pray for his peoples, that he had secured safe passage for English pilgrims and merchants through Burgundy, and that he would enforce just law and forbid unjust exactions, which shows a Danish conqueror speaking the language of English kingship and presenting himself as a protector of travelers as well as a ruler of armies. Pilgrimage was politics. A king who could walk to Rome and return proved his power was recognized beyond the North Sea. Canute's empire stretched wide. He ruled England, Denmark from 1018 and Norway from 1028, creating a North Sea realm that linked the Baltic to the Thames. That empire was not a single state with one law, but three kingdoms held by one man who moved between them. English silver pennies, minted in Lincoln and York and London, traveled to Gotland and to Dublin, where they are found in hoards today, which shows that Canute's peace made England a source of coin that funded trade from Russia to Ireland, and that English wealth, once drained by Danegeld, now flowed outward as currency of high reputation. Stability paid. The Chronicle recorded no major Viking raids on England during Canute's reign after 1018. Juan died in 1035. He was about 40 at the height of his power and left two sons by different wives. Harold Harefoot, son of Elfgifu of Northampton, claimed England, while Harthacnut, son of Emma, held Denmark. Harthacnut could not come because Magnus of Norway threatened Denmark, so Harold ruled as regent and then as king from 1037 to 1040, while Emma kept Wessex for Harthacnut, and while Edward, her son by Aethelred, waited in Normandy, which meant that England had two kings in quick succession, and that the succession was decided by who could reach Winchester first, rather than by any law. Harold died in 1040. Harthacnut then landed, demanded £62,000 in tribute, and died 2 years later. By 1042, the Danish dynasty ended. Harthacnut died at a wedding feast at Lambeth, perhaps from a stroke, aged about 24. The English magnates then chose Edward, son of Aethelred and Emma, who had lived 25 years in Normandy. That choice restored the old West Saxon line, but it also brought to England a king who spoke Norman French as easily as English, who had Norman friends, and who had seen how Norman dukes governed with castles and knights, which would shape the last 24 years of Anglo-Saxon England in ways that neither Aethelred nor Canute could have foreseen. The wheel turned. England was again ruled by an English king, but under a shadow from across the Channel. The Second Viking Age left scars. Fields in Wessex had been taxed to pay Danegeld, churches had been burned, and men had seen their kings flee. Yet the administrative machine built by Alfred and Edgar survived, because it could count hides and mint coins for any master. Canute's reign showed that Danish kings could rule England with English law, that English ealdormen could serve Danish lords, and that England's wealth, once a lure for raiders, could fund a North Sea empire that stretched from Dublin to Norway, which meant that England was now part of a larger world whether it wanted to be or not. That world included Normandy. Emma's two marriages had tied England to Normandy by blood that would be claimed in 1066. Canute was buried at Winchester. He lay in the old minster beside Edmund and near the bones of Alfred's family, a Dane among English kings. His North Sea empire died with his sons, but his law codes and coinage remained. When Edward returned from Normandy, he inherited not a ruined kingdom, but a wealthy one that had been governed by a man who learned to speak its language, to endow its churches, and to keep its shires in peace, which is why the Chronicle could call Canute's last years peaceful, even though his father had burned England from coast to coast. Peace was fragile. It rested on a dynasty that died young, leaving an old exile to take its place. Chapter 10: The Last Kingdom. Edward came back in 1042. He was about 39, had spent most of his life in Normandy, and spoke Norman French as easily as English. The English magnates chose him because he was son of Aethelred and Emma, and because no better claimant was at hand. He inherited a kingdom that was wealthy, well administered, and governed by earls who controlled great territories, because Canute's system of four earldoms had survived under his sons, and because men like Godwine of Wessex, Leofric of Mercia, and Siward of Northumbria held armies and revenues that rivaled the king's own. Kingship was negotiated. Edward learned quickly that he could not rule without those earls, even if he preferred Norman clerks. Godwine was the most powerful. He had risen from obscurity under Canute, married Geitha, sister of a Danish jarl, and fathered many sons. His sons Sweg, Harold, Tostig, Gyrth, and Leofwine held or would hold earldoms that stretched from Kent to Northumbria. Godwine's daughter Edith married Edward in 1045, which tied the Godwine family to the throne, because a king who married the daughter of his greatest earl hoped to secure loyalty, and because a family that gave a queen hoped to make its blood royal in the next generation. The marriage was childless. That childlessness would later leave England without a clear heir from Edward's own body. Edward kept Norman friends. He appointed Robert of Jumièges as Bishop of London in 1044 and as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1051. Robert brought Norman clerks who wrote charters in a style familiar to Fécamp but strange to Canterbury monks. Edward also gave lands in Herefordshire to Normans like Osborne Pentecost, who built a castle of earth and timber that the English called strange, because English lords did not yet build private fortifications that could be held against a king, and because a castle implied a different kind of lordship that relied on stone and on men who served for land rather than for kinship. Castles were few. They marked Edward as a king who looked across the channel for models of power. The crisis came in 1051. Men of Dover attacked Eustace of Boulogne, who was returning from a visit to Edward, and Edward ordered Godwine to punish Dover. Godwine refused, saying the townsmen should have a trial, and gathered his sons and their war bands. Edward called Leofric and Siward, whose forces outnumbered Godwine's, and Godwine and his family fled, Harold and Leofwine to Ireland, Godwine, Tostig, and Sweg to Flanders, while Queen Edith was sent to a nunnery at Wilton and stripped of her lands. Edward seemed victorious. In 1052, Godwine returned with ships, sailed up the Thames and forced Edward to restore his family. Edward built at Westminster. On Thorney Island, a mile west of London, he refounded an abbey dedicated to St. Peter. The church was large, in Romanesque style with Norman arches and thick walls, unlike smaller English churches. Edward intended it as his burial place and as a royal church close enough to London to show that kingship had a spiritual center near the commercial center, because London's wealth paid for stone that had to be brought by boat, and because a church that large required masons who knew how to build with ashlar rather than rubble. It was consecrated in December 1065. Edward was too ill to attend and was carried from his palace to watch from a distance. Godwine died in 1053. He collapsed at a royal feast at Winchester and died days later, leaving Harold as Earl of Wessex. Harold, born around 1022, had fought in Wales with his brother Tostig and understood both war and politics. By 1065, Harold held Wessex and his brothers held East Anglia, Mercia through marriage alliance, and Northumbria until revolt, which meant that the Godwine family controlled more hidage and more ships than the king himself, because their earldoms collected the revenues that once went directly to the crown. Power looked hereditary, yet it still depended on the king's favor and on the support of other earls. In 1065, Northumbria revolted. Vegans led by Morcar of Mercia expelled Tostig, Harold's brother, complaining that he taxed too heavily and murdered rivals. Tostig had killed Gamal, son of Orm, and Ulf, son of Dolfin, in his own chamber, according to the Northern Chronicle. Harold met the rebels at Northampton, where Morcar's men had burned villages and taken cattle, and chose to accept their demand that Morcar become Earl of Northumbria, because Harold needed Mercian support for the succession, and because he judged that keeping his brother in the north would cost more men than abandoning him. Tostig fled to Flanders. From there he sought allies who would help him reclaim his earldom and revenge his humiliation. Edward died on 5 January 1066. He was about 62, childless, and had not named an heir clearly enough to prevent dispute. 4 men could claim the throne: Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and Edgar Atheling, grandson of Edmund Ironside. William claimed Edward had promised him the throne in 1051, and that Harold had sworn on holy relics to support him during a visit to Normandy in 1064, while Harold Hardrada claimed the throne through a treaty between Magnus and Harthacnut, and while Edgar had the best hereditary claim but was only about 14 and had no army. Harold acted first. On 6 January, the day after Edward's burial at Westminster, he was crowned king in the same abbey. The Bayeux Tapestry shows that day. Made in England within a generation, probably at Canterbury, it depicts Edward on his deathbed touching Harold's hand. The next scene shows Harold crowned, with Stigand, Archbishop of Canterbury, standing beside him, though Stigand's position was contested. The tapestry, 70 meters long and embroidered with wool on linen, was not a Norman record alone, but an English product that told a story its Norman patrons wanted, because it included Harold's oath to William and omitted any mention of Edgar Atheling, which shows how art could be used to justify conquest while still preserving English stitching and English humor in its margins. It is propaganda and craft. Its lower border shows fables and farm work that have nothing to do with kings. William prepared carefully. Duke of Normandy since 1035, he had fought to keep his duchy and had built castles and knights into a formidable force. In summer 1066, he gathered ships at Daves and then at St. Valery, waiting for wind and for papal support. Pope Alexander II gave him a banner, which meant that William could present his invasion as a pilgrimage to punish an oath-breaker, and because Harold had been crowned by Stigand, who had been excommunicated by one pope and never recognized by another, William could claim that God favored reform and that Norman bishops would bring proper order to an English church that Rome saw as too close to secular power. Ships waited for weeks. Norman sources said William prayed in his tent while his men gambled and sang. Harold Hardrada moved first. King of Norway since 1047, he had fought in Byzantium as a Varangian and claimed England through old agreements. In September 1066, he sailed with about 300 ships, joined Tostig in Scotland, and entered the Humber. At Fulford on 20 September, he defeated Edwin and Morcar, Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, whose levies broke before Norwegian axes, and he then took York without a siege because the citizens agreed to pay tribute and to host his men, which gave him a base that Edward and Harold had both used before. Harold Godwinson marched north. He covered nearly 200 miles in 4 days, gathering his housecarls and leaving his shire levies behind. Stamford Bridge was fought on 25 September. Harold Hardrada and Tostig waited on the east side of the Derwent, expecting hostages from York and not a full English army. The Chronicle said the Norwegians had left their mailcoats on their ships because of heat and overconfidence. Harold's advance was so sudden that one Norwegian had to hold the narrow bridge alone with an axe, cutting down 40 Englishmen before he was killed from below. And that story, whether true or embellished, shows how close a river crossing could decide a battle that would decide a kingdom, because the bridge gave Harold time to form his shield wall on firm ground. Hardrada died. An arrow in the throat killed him, and Tostig fell soon after under the Raven banner. 3 days later, William sailed. On 28 September, while Harold was still in York celebrating and resting his wounded, Norman ships landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. The old Roman fort at Pevensey, its walls still standing, became William's first stronghold in England. William moved to Hastings, built a castle of earth and timber in days, and ravaged the surrounding countryside because he needed to force Harold to march south quickly, and because a king who allowed his own land to be burned without response would lose the trust of thanes who expected protection in return for service. Harold marched south again. He covered the distance from York to London in about 5 days, a feat remembered even by Norman writers. Hastings was fought on 14 October 1066. Harold arrayed his army on Senlac Ridge, with housecarls and Theans forming a shield wall behind a ditch. William had cavalry, archers, and infantry, a combination English armies did not use in the same way. The battle lasted from morning until dusk, with Norman feigned retreats that drew parts of the English line down the hill, with arrows that fell short at first and then found gaps, and with charges that broke against a wall that held for hours, because Englishmen fought on foot with axes and spears, and because they believed their king stood behind them as Ethelstan and Alfred had stood before. By evening the wall broke. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine fell, and then Harold himself was killed. How Harold died is debated. The Bayeux tapestry shows a figure with an arrow in the eye near the inscription Harold was killed. William of Poitiers, William's chaplain, said Harold died in the press of battle, hacked down by knights. Both accounts may be true, because an arrow could wound and a sword could finish, and because Norman writers wanted to show divine punishment through an eye wound for an oath breaker, while English sources wanted to show a king who died fighting among his housecarls rather than fleeing like earlier kings who had abandoned their men. His body was identified later. Edith Swanwick, his companion, was said to have recognized him by marks only she knew. William marched to London. He burned Southwark, avoided London Bridge, and crossed the Thames at Wallingford where Archbishop Stigand submitted. At Berkhamsted, Edgar Atheling, Edwin, and Morcar surrendered and accepted William as king. On 25 December 1066, William was crowned at Westminster Abbey, the same church Edward had built and Harold had been crowned in, and during the coronation, Norman guards outside, hearing shouting inside, set fire to houses around the abbey, which shows that conquest was not yet peace, and that London learned immediately what Norman rule would mean when its new king could not control his own men. Anglo-Saxon England ended. Its earls were replaced, its language pushed from court, and its land measured for Domesday. The conquest succeeded for several reasons. William had cavalry and castles, papal support, and a single purpose, while Harold had fought two major battles in 3 weeks. English administration survived, which helped Normans govern, because shire courts and hide assessments made taxation easier. Domesday Book, commissioned in 1006, recorded every hide, every plough, and every pig in a language that was Latin but using English units, which shows that Norman kings kept Anglo-Saxon tools even as they replaced Anglo-Saxon lords, because counting was more valuable than destroying, and because a kingdom that could be counted could be held. Conquest was thorough. By 1087, less than 10% of English land remained in English hands, according to Domesday calculations. The last kingdom became shire and abbey again. Westminster Abbey, built by Edward and consecrated in Harold's short reign, still stands where Norman and English stone meet. At Hastings, the ground still rises to Senlac Ridge, where sheep graze over ground that held a shield wall for a day. What had begun with Hengist at Ebbsfleet and Augustine in Kent ended with a Norman duke at Winchester claiming a crown made by Mercian coin, Alfred's books, and Edgar's anointing, which is why English kept plough and pig while Normans gave beef and court. The island continued. Its roads still pointed to London, even when London spoke with a new accent.